Welcome to the Science Salon podcast. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. We post these conversations on average once a week as part of the larger mission of the Skeptic Society and Skeptic Magazine, a 501c3 nonprofit science educational organization devoted to promoting science and reason. We depend upon and appreciate your support, so if you find this podcast valuable, along with our magazine and the other projects we work on, please support us at skeptic.com/donate. There you'll find you can make a one-time or recurring donations via PayPal or Patreon. You can make a direct donation via Shop Skeptic at skeptic.com, or you can send us a check by mail or even call us up and give us a credit card number. To that end, I want to thank everybody that donated for our 2018 fundraising campaign. We're now well into 2019, and your support is what makes all this possible. My guest today is Gregg Hurwitz. He is the New York Times #1 internationally best-selling author of 20 thrillers, including Out of the Dark, which comes out this week that we release this podcast, and 2 award-winning thriller novels for teens. His novels have won numerous literary awards, graced the top 10 lists, and have been published in 30 languages. Gregg has written screenplays for or sold spec scripts to many of the major studios, including The Book of Henry. And he's written, developed, and produced television for various networks. He's also the New York Times best-selling comic book writer, having penned stories for Marvel, such as Wolverine and Punisher, and DC Comics, Batman and Penguin. He's published numerous academic articles on Shakespeare, taught fiction writing in the USC English Department, and guest lectured for UCLA and for Harvard in the United States and internationally. In the course of researching his thrillers, he has sneaked into demolition ranges with Navy SEALs, swum with sharks in the Galapagos, and gone undercover into mind control cults. Gregg grew up in the Bay Area, and while completing a BA from Harvard and a master's degree in Trinity College, he studied Shakespearean tragedy, and then from that he wrote his first novel. He was also a student of Jordan Peterson, and in this podcast we discuss Jordan to a certain extent, and more generally the concept of myths and archetypes and narrative, and to what extent something like a religious archetype can be real in a scientific sense, or just mythically real or psychologically real. And we get into that and talk about what it's like to write a narrative story, develop characters, and how that's done related to these deeper mythic topics. We also talk about Gregg's work with the Democratic Party. He is a consultant for some politicians on essentially script writing in a way, screenwriting. When you convey a message as a politician, you want to capture not just votes, but the support of your constituency, and really it does come down to who has the better story. So we also discuss Trump's narrative story versus Bernie's versus Hillary's in the 2016 election, what has to change for Democrats for the upcoming 2020 election. And then we also get into talking about what it's like to be a public intellectual, which is where this particular podcast starts. We didn't start there. I started there introducing his new book, which is Out of the Dark, which comes out this week, as I mentioned, and we had some audio problems, a connection with Skype, and so we had to change the server we were on, and then it worked there. So it feels like it sort of just comes out of the middle of nowhere. He had just asked me about what it's like to be a public intellectual as a nonfiction writer versus he is a fiction writer, and so we kind of jump into it there. So that's the context of that. So with that, I'll give you Gregg Hurwitz.
Okay, so is that better?
Yep, so far it looks good.
Great. So I'll just pick up at the start of that question.
Yep.
Okay, where were we on it?
Public intellectuals.
Okay. Yeah. So one of the things in the examples that you're giving of these people who can go on Colbert or who speak to it, I'm wondering if there's a fundamental shift between public intellectuals and let's just say academicians in Big Five trait openness. Because I was thinking about when I was reading Heavens on Earth, which I'll now hold up because I love this cover.
Thanks.
But I mean, you talk about your relationship with Chopra and going to the 3 days to to meditate with him and to look at your diet. And I love your observation that like, oh, if I could laugh more and rest more and meditate more, I could be happier based on your unique genetic state or something. It's like, well, that's probably pretty good advice for anybody.
Right.
But there's a high openness there that's in play. One of the things I enjoy so much in your writing is, you'll reference The Simpsons as much as you'll reference the Old Testament. So there's a real gathering of high culture and popular culture to weave a picture of a whole that I think is much more relatable. And I'm wondering if there's a difference if people get protective within their particular dominance hierarchy. Like, let's say that it's just academia. Someone's an academician of philosophy. If they're not trait openness, I wonder if there is a desire to shutter out and to sort of judge negatively people who are expanding into different dominance hierarchies or into different areas of expertise, that you start to place a higher value on the one thing that you're within rather than, I mean, like for you, you're very game to go. And where did you go for that long weekend?
Chopra, I went to the Chopra Center down in Carlsbad, California. Yeah, where Deepak has his place.
Yeah, and it's like, that's a pretty high openness endeavor for the guy who started Skeptic Magazine, right?
I am high in openness. The problem with skepticism is if you're too closed-minded, too closed to new ideas, then you're going to miss out on the ones that turn out to be correct. Now, most of them are not. Most hypotheses that scientists throw out are not true. So that's why science operates on that principle that Karl Popper called conjecture and refutation. You conjecture, you're spitballing ideas, you're throwing them out there. Most of them are shot down. The ones left standing are the ones that have a best chance of being true with a small t. Okay, so it's a little bit like that. I'm just kind of open to the idea that, well, I don't want to miss out on the 2 out of 100 that turn out to be correct. So I'm going to keep an open mind, but not so open-minded that I think psychic powers are real and Bigfoot's real or whatever. You can go too far the other way. So that there's a balance there. I did a Big Five personality scale on posthumously on Carl Sagan, Alfred Russel Wallace, and Stephen Jay Gould when he was still alive. I had his colleagues and friends, or in the case of Wallace, historians, take the Big Five personality inventory. Like, instead of I see myself as someone who is fill in the blank, I see Carl Sagan as someone who was whatever. And it turned out both Sagan and Gould were high in openness to experience, but they were also high in conscientiousness and high in tough-mindedness. On the tough-minded part of the scale, they were very high. So it's like, I'm open to your new idea.
And by that, do you mean disagreeableness?
Disagreeableness of the tough-minded is. In other words, I'm open to your new idea, but if you're bullshitting me, I'm going to kick you out. I'm going to kick you in the ass for that. And I think that's a good balance. Alfred Russel Wallace was super nice. He was like the super highest on the tender-mindedness scale. Very agreeable and open. So he was open to psychics and the spirituality movement and phrenology, and he would go to seances and hold everybody's hands, and the table would levitate. He'd go home and write about it. Oh my God, I'm a scientist. I can't figure out. So it's got to be real. Whereas someone like Huxley, who was very tough-minded, he did comment on this. Basically it's all bullshit. And so I think the balance there is between open-mindedness, trait open-mindedness, and high in something like tough-mindedness or disagreeableness, so that you don't fall for bullshit, because there's a lot of bullshit out there.
It's funny, the process that you describe of that, which makes perfect sense, that's a lot of the process that we call blue skying in a TV room when you're running a TV show. You have the template, you have a pilot, and then you're sitting down and you give everyone permission to throw anything out when you're blue skying. It doesn't matter, because you don't know which stupid ideas lead to good ideas. You don't know which wrong turns wind you up in the right neighborhood of a potential story idea. And so initially, early on in the process, you want to kind of liberate everybody. And it's a similar process as a novelist or screenwriter writing solo that you do. At the beginning of a story, all the possibilities have to be open. And then as you make choices and you develop a character, what happens is the circumstances by which the narrative needs to proceed get necessarily limited if you're true to your characters and your story. It's one of the reasons why we have a repellent reaction to a deus ex machina. If something just sails in the third act and fixes everything, we're annoyed because it doesn't feel like it's part of the organic connection of the story. So as you're furthering, there's an interesting process to it that you have to start wildly open, But the best thing as you get towards the end of a story is when you feel like the actions themselves are surprising, but also completely inevitable based on the reality that you've built in the narrative. So there's a sort of narrowing of the scope process that happens that I'd imagine is a lot like you zeroing in on whether you think something's a hoax or not. But you're willing to start with the lens blown wide open. I mean, you're willing to go down to Carlsbad and spend 3 days with, singing bowls and meditation, because good for you, because you don't know what things are right and what things aren't and what things make sense unless you're willing to go in really openly and experience them.
Yeah, that's right. So there I make the distinction when you say something works. I make a distinction between works for you personally versus works in a more scientific sense. So does meditation work, or does going to a center like Deepak Chopra's center, does it work? Well, if you go to a 4-star, 5-star resort at the beach in Carlsbad, California, and drink tea and do yoga and exercise and meditate and get massage and eat great food, and you don't feel better, there's something really wrong with you. I mean, anybody would feel better. Okay, so there's that. But then there's but I have this problem, whatever it is, arthritis or autoimmune disease or something, and it worked for me. Does it really work? Like if we had 100 patients that went in with your particular disorder and 69% of them got better and 20% had no effect and the others got worse or whatever. There it's much harder to find studies on that. I just wrote this review of a book on recovery from injuries in sports, any kind of athletic recovery. And the problem is there's next to no research on this. In the second sense that I mean, does it work? There's tons of stuff like ice plunges work. No, hot tubs work. No, massage works. No, chiropractic. No, try, the electrical stimulation. No, the floating tanks. No. And it's very faddish. And every athlete you talk to, they have their formula. This is what works for me. Now, I can't say that this works for 69% of athletes who have this injury that try this modality will get better. We're really out of our league on most of these big topics.
So I travel a ton, right, with book tours and work and different stuff. And getting sick on the road is the worst, because I got sick one time the second week of like a 2-month book tour, and I'd get better, I'd go on a plane, I'd come off and be sick again. So a friend of mine gave me these like special magical Chinese herb pills that you take them at the first sign of getting a cold, if you're, especially if you're traveling, and it knocks out the cold. And every time when I take them, I delight in the fact that they might be placebo effect,
right.
But that, like, for me, I'm fully invested with taking them and having zero interest in whether it's placebo effect or actually effective. And for some reason, that combination works for me. So it's a different version of your athlete with his ice plunges, of me going into it knowing already in advance that it might be complete bullshit, but still like finding it to be an effective lever I can pull when I need to not be sick.
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the placebo effect. It's just your body doing something that makes you feel better. And if that works for you, fine. Just again, once we slide into the area of quackery and pseudoscience and stuff, my concern is that then someone markets it and says this works for everybody at $4.95 a pill or whatever. Then we're really off the rails there.
All right, I have another question I'm sorry. Did you have?
No.
So, all right. So you and I talked about this briefly when we overlapped at the Colette party up in Toronto, which was a lot of fun, but slightly too cold.
Yeah.
And so we had to warm ourselves with bourbon, as you and I are wont to do. Yes. And I was talking about this with you. So with Jordan, who has a religious base, like whatever that means, right? It's
well, you know him better than I do. What does that mean?
Well, I think he has a belief in the inherent value of archetypal religious narrative and the wisdom embodied therein. Meaning it's not necessarily that it's a guy with a white beard floating in the sky, but that there's an unbelievable amount of knowledge that is embedded in biblical stories, and that those have not only provide a roadmap to our lives and orienting us towards meaning, but also that there is I believe I'm not overstating to say he's aware that there's a different level of spiritual development and evolution that comes through the cleaving of those stories too. Not just that you make your life more meaningful, but also that there's another component that you can guide through. So people who have some form of a religious background, I'm very interested in this because I was raised by a family. I am more unconventionally mystical, which I cringe to even say, but like, I have a big belief in archetypal narrative, and there's certain aspects of transcendentalism that appeal to me. I'm very aware that my senses are enormously limited in comparison to the number of senses that we could have. So I have a much more open door, but I'm from a family of very sort of atheist, very liberal Jews, like East Coast. And you know that drill.
Yep.
Like all of religion is just made up. There's no benefit to it. It's the opiate of the masses. But what always interested me so much was that my parents have a very high moral code that they conduct their lives by. It's oriented towards helping people. It's oriented towards levels of perfectionism in their work. My mom's a social worker. My dad's a physician. And they have this really firm moral and ethical boundaries and parameters by which they conduct themselves. And I was talking to you about this a little bit with your work with, Skeptic Journal and your intellectual work. Is there's a real, like, I couldn't do anything to get you any more than I could Christopher Hitchens to concede through high agreeableness or politeness or wanting to get along that you think God exists for X, Y, and Z reasons. Like, you have a very firm belief in your intellectual positions and the way that you approach the world. And it's deeply, deeply ethical in a way that's grounded and almost religious in a more conventional sense. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where, because I share that and I came from that, but I'm always curious about where that is derived from, because you can't just put it on, here's what it says in the Bible and here's my belief in my faith, right? So I'm a little bit more wobbly and in the middle on these things. There's a lot I'm still figuring out in those regards, but there's an intellectual approach that we share. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about where that comes from, of these like very firm ethics, intellectual ethics by which you conduct your life, your research, and your thinking.
Yeah. By the way, do you call yourself an atheist or a non-theist, or just agnostic, or you don't call yourself anything?
I just call myself confused and aware that there's more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of.
Well, I mean, I know a lot of secular Jews who very much respect religion, and not just the culture and the food and the holidays and all that, but the deeper sort of archetypal traditions, if you will, of the Old Testament, while not believing in the supernatural at all, no deity. And it seems to me reasonable to argue, as I would with Jordan, that he's right on this in the sense that these people thousands of years ago figured out certain characteristics of human nature and the way the world is. For example, it's a dangerous place, it's harsh, life is nasty, brutish, and short, and so on. So there's certain things we need to develop character-wise in ourselves and in our communities and in larger societies to survive, and here they are. And, you sort of march through the big stories with the archetypes and ideas, and they more or less kind of fit what, say, evolutionary psychologists may argue. Yes, those are evolved characteristics for survival purposes without God at all. And what makes people like Dawkins and Harris and myself nervous about Jordan is he doesn't go so far as to say, I don't think there's a supernatural deity at all, but these smart, wise people figured out some certain characteristics of human nature. He sort of hints around that. And but that's what I think. I think you can read the Bible and pick out the parts that are useful and so on based on what we know. There's a tradition now in evolutionary psychology, sort of a branch off of that of studying literature from an evolutionary perspective. Why is it Shakespeare and Jane Austen and Dostoevsky and so on? What makes them great literature? What makes that great literature is because they've tapped into, just through observation and intuition or whatever, life experience. These are the things that really drive people's motivations and societies and good and evil and conflict and so on. And it turns out they're probably right. It has to do with hierarchy and power structure and who's sleeping with who and, who has power and who doesn't. Why don't they have power? It's just kind of the really basics of human nature. And so that's why I say in my essay about Jordan, yes, you're right about these things, but why graft in these other sort of quasi-supernatural or mystical or, archetype, almost like it's a platonic ideal that's floating out there in space somewhere in cyberspace or in the ether. Why?
Well, the evolutionary argument for narrative to me is abundantly clear. I mean, every culture in the world as a hero myth, right? I mean, it's just, you can find a tribe that's cut off in the middle of the Amazon from anyone else forever. And you know when you find them, they're going to have eyelids and opposable thumbs and a hero's journey, because that's what teaches people to orient, themselves against the unknown, both externally, symbolically, literally, and then also internally. What's the best method to deal with what's going on with yourself internally that you don't know, and being open to that, and being voluntarily willing to engage in some battle with that, and come out with the gold. The dragon's always guarding gold, which makes no sense, because why would a dragon want gold? But the confrontation with the thing that you fear that could devour you, and if you can overcome that, then you have this sort of self-awareness that's the gold, which then you bring back to and discuss in society. I mean, so that's for me, there's a very clear evolutionary argument that that dropped into us. Isn't that story itself, but rather the mechanisms and the neural networks to generate a story like the hero myth is a necessity, because we can't survive without stories and narratives, which are part of the sort of software through which we view the world. As cultures, as civilizations, we cannot survive without those stories to orient us in a meaning-making way in terms of how we encounter and deal with the unknown. And so the evolutionary argument for certain types of narrative, I think, is very compelling, even before you dip into anything supernatural or spiritual.
Yeah. Now, you're a novelist. I'm not. When you develop your character and plot, do you think about these things, or does it come naturally?
Well, it's so funny. A lot of people teach structure. There's a lot of courses that are like, if you take a writing class or a screenwriting class, what they're teaching is structure. His last day of retirement, before he's going to go into a stick up at a gas station, we all roll our eyes because we know he's going to get killed. Like, there's all these tricks about the ways that stories structure out and build and set personal stakes we're so familiar with. What you can't teach is character, because those little telling details that make you love someone or relate to somebody, and dialogue, which is different every time out. You can't teach good dialogue. There's some rules and parameters, but if you don't have an ear for the music in people's voices, if you can't sit on a subway and just listen to people talking and take in those mannerisms and be able to reproduce and invent them, it really can't be taught. And so what's interesting is, I think I thought about some of this stuff more towards the beginning of my career. I started quite young writing books, and I think I had more of a cerebral structural framework. But what you quickly realize is, when you're writing well, none of that is relevant in a weird way, because you have to embody and internalize it and be writing with such specificity that it's almost like you've forgotten about it, and it floats out there as a shadowy backdrop in the back of your head of how structure should work. If you're writing and filling in the blanks, it's sort of like painting by numbers, and you don't get to Van Gogh by painting by numbers, right?
Right.
So there's something that some people say about adapting a book, because I've adapted for screenplay and TV my own books, other people's books, and the same thing for film. And one of the lessons somebody says is, read the book 3 times and then stick it in a drawer and then write the adaptation. I think there's a similar thing to that with understanding archetypal narrative, which is, I always say, don't go take a writing course that teaches you story structure. If you want to be a novelist, go read 2,000 novels. Right. Like read them and embody them, because you're playing you're trying to make the epic specific. Right. And in the specificity, you can't have your eye too much on the epic. You have to have internalized it. So it's sort of driving your lizard brain in a weird way as you're working out a story in real time. And I often have no idea what my books are really about for me psychologically, as obvious as it may seem on the surface of it, until I'm done with them. And I think and look back and go, oh, right, this book, I wrote a book called You're Next that was a very emotional thriller for me. I got all the way to the end. It was very emotional writing the ending. And then I looked back on it and realized that it was really about me grappling with my new feelings of vulnerability around becoming a parent. But and it's obvious, it's right there in the story in a weird way. But I was just thinking in the story. I was just thinking in those characters. I was just thinking in how they relate to each other. And it's a similar thing too with Orphan X. I mean, I have this character who was raised in, we're trained to be an assassin, pulled out of a foster home. He's given this rigid set of 10 commandments that govern his life, right? Never make it personal, assume nothing, how you do anything is how you do everything. And when we meet him in Orphan X and in all these books, he's starting to break out of that. He's left the program and he's trying to sort of reinvent himself in a new manner of living that feels more human. And so here I am on the verge of launching the fourth one, Out of the Dark, which you talked about. And only like a month ago did I realize that that's really a stand-in for a lot of the reappraisal that I started to do around when I turned 40, of figuring out that the rules and the templates for myself as a striving young man archetype that led me with a certain measure of success through the front half of life, are not rules and conditions that will work for me as well if I need to embody new values and transform myself and occupy a different relationship between myself and humanity in my relationships for the back half of my life. So I've been dealing with that, it's been a pretty significant thing that I've been wrestling with. And then, Jordan was down here one night and we're drinking bourbon by the fireplace and we start having this conversation and it was like, oh, everything that I've been writing for the last 5 years in these Orphan X books are about this process for this character that didn't occur to me as exactly the process that I'm going through in my own life. I mean, it's obvious as you can, it's so obvious. And by the same token, it makes perfect sense, but it's the stories when they're good, you're driving them through. It's like your subconscious is putting them through a filter that makes them personal. So if I set out with the starting point to be like, hey, I'm really struggling with issues in my life and I want to write a story where the characters symbolize that, I think it would be very flat and it would feel like fill in the blanks. It would feel like propaganda because I know why I was writing it.
Does a good screenwriter or novelist need some life experiences where you've suffered or you've been sad or depressed or angry or whatever to add more depth to the characters and the story?
Yes. I mean, I think it's so funny because as we get older, we look back on these different lessons, like the Greeks, that suffering is knowledge, right? And you're reading this in high school or something and you haven't really understood the kinds of suffering that you've had and why that's knowledge. So I think like the older that I get, the more appreciation I have that every single thing that you encounter is a challenge in a process of integrating more knowledge, whether it's horrific or not. And that's not a Pollyanna thing to stitch on a throw pillow for, and send to people when they get diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. It's like, I get that life is horrific and tragic, but it is a very interesting repositioning to be aware of the fact that all the hardship and turmoil all goes into the same meaning mechanism that drives us. And my particular, factory issue software that I run is a storytelling mechanism, right? Mm-hmm. And so it goes into that for me. And I think I'm closer to real time when that happens, of realizing what I have to learn from it, even if it's horrible and awful. So I do think that's the case. I mean, I think also, there's a lot of kids now who will come out and say, oh, I studied screenwriting in college and did a, screenwriting MFA, and now I'm writing and it's like, what are you going to write a screenplay about? Right. So it was funny. So, I studied very broadly undergrad. I just had an instinct. I started my first novel when I was 19, but I was studying English and American Lit and psychology. Jordan was my thesis advisor, which was incredibly amusing and amazing. But I was taking every elective I could take was in international relations or opera or symphony. I was really trying to have as broad an intellectual base as possible. And then the high trait openness means like I'll go anywhere and do anything and have conversations with anyone. And so it's a lot of good training because as a novelist, you're really trying to pull on the mask of your character and see the world through their eye holes. So that high trait openness is really important. I don't think it carries with it the same edge that you require, you personally, as an intellectual and founder of Skeptic Magazine, because part of me is like, let me go all the way down this path and just see how you think. Like it's more of a straight joining instinct. But I found with some of the political work I've been doing lately, which is talking to party leadership about ending polarization, it's incredibly valuable because I can really inhabit the shoes of the opposing side of an argument or of different philosophies. Like if I can write a rapist or a serial killer convincingly, and a lot of my training is to try to embody that, right? How does a sniper see the world, right? How does he experience the heartbeat in his throat? How does he listen to the rush of his blood in his ears? When it comes to these really sticky, polarized situations that we're dealing with, I think I can come not just from a position where it's like manipulative and strategic for marketing and messaging to people who think differently so we can win, but really trying to embody the opposing viewpoints in a way that I hope can help foster some understanding to talk about the tectonics that underlie the content that everyone's fighting up here about the content, right? That's all those storms that we see.
Yeah,
but I'm very interested in what's going on down here. Like, what are people's fears and vulnerabilities? What's the worldview? What's the dystopic worldview that they see the other side of the aisle advocating?
Right.
And what's their fear of that becoming a reality? So it's a very weird set of interests, with writing books.
Yeah, I want to get into that in just a moment in more depth because, we're about to hit 2020 election run-up campaigns here now, and who has the better story may be the deciding factor. That's why your work and that of Jordan and so on, it's almost like Trump's hitting one kind of archetype and the Democrats need to find a narrative archetype that's as good as that, and obviously they haven't had one in a couple of years. So, but just to back up a second, I read your novel, The Survivor, and so your bad guy, I forget if it was Russian or Ukrainian, but and he puts the hero in a block of ice so he can torture him, and so he lives longer because of the block of. How did you figure that out? I mean, there's research on this, or did you just make that up? I mean, the details you have, like how to kill somebody or how to torture somebody, how do you know that? I'm always curious where you guys come up with this.
You get me in a lot of trouble. So with Out of the Dark, where Orphan X is going after the corrupt president of the United States, like my search engine is enough to just have me instantly arrested if I didn't have a track record already. I mean, all of my search terms are like hotel balcony with best view of White House.
Right.
And, like magazine. I mean, it's a disaster. So I have an eye scenarios or an ear for scenarios. I think one question I'm always asking myself, and it's a thriller writer mindset, is like, what's the worst possible thing that could happen right now? So, and there's a lot of little tiny facts that I'll pick up and ruminate on. And then what I do is I want to research them. Research in books, it's a real trick because you have to know, like what you see in the book is the tip of the iceberg, but you have to know the whole iceberg to know what tip goes in. And it's funny because when I was younger, I think when I researched, and like I went to Galapagos and swam with sharks, and I went undercover to mind control cults, like I've done all this stuff in the name of research. And I had this drive to put everything in the book because it was so cool, right? Or because it made me look smarter, right? But one of the things that you realize is like everything has to only serve the story. And so when I come up with a scenario, what I want to do is research enough and get enough facts, like sort of telling detail packed around a scenario that it will carry the reader over the suspension of disbelief and make it real enough to be chilling, but not so much that you're feeling bogged down like you're reading my research journals. And so there's a real balance between imagination and the right number of facts to embed something and make it come alive, right? Because I always want the reader to feel like they have a front row seat to the action, like they're smelling it and feeling it and sensing it. And so it's sort of a dialogue between the imagination and the reality and the research. And if the balance is off one way or another, if it's too much imagination, you lose a reader due to suspension of disbelief. And if it's too much research, you lose them because you're boring them or you're belaboring something that is outside the story itself. You've made the story secondary, and people don't want to stay in a story if they feel like the story is secondary.
Right. Yeah, I like the detail. It's a minor point here for most readers who wouldn't know and maybe they don't care. But at least in the novel I read, The Survivor, you take them up these roads that I happen to know because I'm a cyclist, like Bouquet Canyon or Mulholland Drive or whatever. It's like, and you're right. That's exactly what they're like. And I sort of like that there's a certain attention to detail, which makes me think that torturing somebody in a block of ice probably actually would work to keep them alive longer so they suffer more.
Well, so, we'll try it next time you're down visiting. Yeah.
By the way, on the flight back from Toronto after the Colette event, I watched the film Mary Shelley. The author of Frankenstein. Now, I didn't know much about her background. She wrote that when she was like 16 or 17 years old. I mean, it's just unbelievable. But that it's really a novel about sort of loneliness and isolation, separation, and that, her mother died. Her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, the author of the Vindication of the Rights of Woman. and her father was, Godwin, also a novelist and printmaker and so on. And but her mother died when she was just a couple months old, and then she married, or not quite married, Percy Shelley, and then their daughter died. And so she suffered a lot by the time she wrote that novel. And that's what made me think: do you really, to be a classic, enduring novel, does the novelist need to have really suffered some life experiences like that?
Yeah, well, I think, it's interesting. I think a lot of artists or entertainers, or, if you look at actors, if you look at even people who have something to say and are trying to say it, a lot of times I think a lot of us felt like outsiders in a certain way, like our perceptual network, either through loss or through hardship. I certainly had some stuff that was defining for me younger in my life that was rough, and that led me to have an acquaintance with the inherent tragedy of life and what it felt like to be massively disempowered. I was bullied pretty badly when I was in 7th grade, and that had a fairly lasting impression on me. And that same year, my mom it was very touch and go. She had breast cancer. We weren't sure what was going to happen there. And so I had this year of feeling very unhooked from the world. Like, I went to school and it was hard, and I came home and it was hard. And there wasn't a really clear place that everything felt safe. And it happened pretty abruptly. And so I think that people have, and I was sensitive in a lot of ways too. Like, I was a more sensitive kid. I wasn't one of those kind of brash kids who could go do whatever. And so a lot of me finding that later on in life was in some ways was protective, but I think it positioned me a little bit outside of the norm, where other people, and I think more of us have this sensation than want to admit, seem to have better answers and haven't figured it out and have an easier go. And there's a very interesting thing with writers and readers that I feel like people who are very, like, let's say bookish, or very interested in creation or in taking in and reading books, there is a little bit of that outsider thing, that we're having a dialogue that's one step removed from life, which is why we're creating it on a different screen. And that relationship between a novelist or I would say, well, I'll say novelist. So I work in 4 fields, right, more or less, in terms of writing narrative. I do books, TV, film, and comics. And books is the most intimate relationship by far, because there's if I sell 1 million copies of a book, there's 1 million different movies that play in the head of every single reader, and they bring all of their hopes and fears and insecurities and desires to that. With comics and film and TV, we've wrestled it down into an image. So everyone's actually seeing the same thing. Of course, they bring their sentiment to it, but they're not reconstructing an entire visual representation in their head of the story. And so a lot of times in books, like, we talk about over explaining or being, saccharine or too on the nose, like those things that readers react to is in a way when you're almost painting the picture too fully, right? Because it takes you out, because you're like, I know what you're doing. You're trying to make me have an emotion, right? And that's annoying, because this is a dialogue between us. And it's different for every single person who reads something. And so one of the aims in writing, and of course this is true in movies and film and TV also, but it's a little bit different with books, is you want to point people towards an emotional experience that they might have. You want to write something towards, like, let's say it's a love scene and the center of the scene is a character saying, I love you. You want to write the whole scene around that, and then you pull out the word, because you don't want to state it baldly, right? You don't want to define it too fully. And it happens a lot with fear too. I've written a lot of scenes where, like, if there's a torture scene, that scene's about to happen, and I will cut the chapter before anything's happened. And people will come up to me and say, that was so much superfluous violence. I can't believe how horrifying and graphic it was. And I'll say, that's all you. I ended the scene before anything happened.
Oh,
but if I close that door on your imagination, what you'll fill in happened in that room is going to be way more horrific for each one of the million of you that creates that in your heads than if I just described it all in its gruesome glory, because then I've kind of pinned it down. So I'm going to leave it to you to terrify yourself. Right? Right.
Yeah, that's like the closed door in The Exorcist. You just hear the noise and the door is there, and, the camera kind of comes up to it, and it's your imagination that's going wild at that point.
That's the benefit with, like, the famous thing that we never see Jaws. We never see the shark in Jaws, or rarely.
Right.
And I mean, thank God that there was all sorts of mechanical problems with Bruce, who was the shark in Jaws. And so they had to use it very, very sparingly. And if that thing had been front and center for the whole movie, it would be far less terrifying or suspenseful.
Yeah. Yeah, so just one last point on this business of narrative and mythology and archetypes and all that. I remember when Bill Moyers hosted Joseph Campbell on that PBS series, and Campbell kind of deconstructed Star Wars, and it's the hero with 1,000 faces. Here's the archetype. You create the hero. He has to leave his home, experience trauma, face death, and so on, and come back with some sort of message, whatever the archetype is. How do we know that's what Star Wars is really trying to do? I mean, or if not that example, like in this conversation,
I think because Lucas read a lot of Joseph Campbell. That's how we know that.
I think that particular one, but like, for example, at that dinner with Jordan, we were talking about something, and then all of a sudden he went off on Pinocchio. And, before I know it, I have no idea what he's talking about. That he wished upon a star. Now, see, the star is up here, the hierarchy, stars represent this, and Pinocchio represents that, and the nose, and the maker, the puppet maker, and so on. And how do we know that's what that story really means? I mean, that's almost a postmodern approach. Like, I bring to it what I think is meaningful, but that's just to me. You have a different interpretation. Or is there a real interpretation? It's archetype number 7 or whatever.
Well, so look, it's this funny thing. I'm not a big fan of postmodernism. Like, it bored me stiff. I was in college, undergrad, studying English, because I loved English and I loved literature. And it was early wave political correctness, where it was Derrida and Foucault, and it was all of that. And I was like, look, I just love literature and want to read it and talk about it. But I do think that there is, it's funny where people want to get, when things become aesthetic, right? And so this is tricky because you're a hard and fast scientist. And by the way, you didn't answer the question of where your intense and rigorous ethical structures came from. So I want to get back to that.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot about that.
So put a pin in that for 1 minute. But I think that with aesthetic stuff, people will go, oh, well, I just thought the book wasn't that good, or, and that's just my opinion. My opinion's equal, right? Or here's my interpretation of a story, and everyone's interpretation of a story is equal. And I don't actually believe that that's the case. I don't think that just because something is an aesthetic judgment that all judgments are equal. Mm-hmm. And so if you're in a writer's room, let's say on a TV show, or someone's giving notes, there are notes that there's no way to prove it in a lab, right, and reproduce it over and over. But it's clear when you're dealing with people who are skilled, or let's say a very skilled showrunner or director, and you're having a conversation, that there can be a take on material being organically integrated into the story versus not, that can approach something that's objective. It's just really hard to pin down what that is. And so I think with Jordan, when he's talking about Pinocchio, for me, it's less about that it's an overlay than saying, well, what a weird thing that Geppetto would wish upon a star. Why would that make any, why do we wish upon stars as people? And then to sort of break that down with a description that I think answers the question in a better way than other descriptions do, because it doesn't make much sense. So it's clear that wishing upon a higher star, to me, is wishing upon some higher idealized state, right? That's the Cain and Abel analysis.
Right.
Is that, in slaying Abel, Cain slayed the more individuated version of himself, and in doing so has nothing to strive for, right? So that's really what the story's about. But to say that if you want a process that's transformative for yourself, or for a wooden puppet that wants to be a real boy, making a wish upon a higher ideal is the thing by which a process of transformation takes place. To me, that's a pretty good explanation. In the absence of a better one, I don't think it's pure postmodernism if somebody says, oh, well, I think the star represents, the Soviet Union. I don't think that's necessarily an equivalent analysis.
Right. Yeah, I think one of the mistakes a lot of scientists and related atheists make of trying to read these stories too literally, and some fundamentalists do as well, For example, when we started Skeptic Magazine, I started getting these articles that people sent in for publication consideration on, say, explaining how the Noachian flood actually happened. It was this earthquake or this, volcano Thera erupted and that caused the sea to split, or when Jesus was up on the cross, here's what actually happened. And he was in a coma because they gave him these drugs, and then he, came to life 3 days later. And my sense was, this is kind of interesting to try to explain these things, but what if there's nothing to explain? It's just a story. It's a story meant to convey some moral homily or some allegory of some kind or another, related to people that are suffering or being oppressed, and they want to escape their oppressors and so on. And it has nothing to do with volcanoes or what happens when you're in a coma or something like that. That, in other words, you're missing the point of the story if you try to read it literally, which also bothers me about fundamentalists and creationists, that you guys are trying to explain that the flood actually happened and here's why and so on. You're missing the point of the story.
Right. And also, like, maybe there was something to that end that caused a flood or the parting of the Red Seas. Maybe there's some super minor, geological event that happened along with 500 others that year, but that one was seized upon and exaggerated because of its symbolic meaning also. So it's like, to explain it doesn't say why it seized hold of the imagination of the people who wrote it down, and why it's been inflated to one of the underlying narratives of all of Western culture. I mean, right. So it misses not only by taking the story too literally, but also why that fact, even if that's true, was chosen and embellished, and polished to a high shine, and held up as one of the jewels of Western culture.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons for the current conflict of science and religion, maybe since the 80s or so, is that because we live in the age of science and scientists garner so much respect, and the scientific narrative story carries so much weight, that people on the other side, religionists say, feel like, well, I have to somehow graft onto my story a patina of science. So we're going to argue that, the dating techniques that geologists use, they're off. We have to stick to the 10,000-year-old Earth and so on, because our story has to be literally real. Not mythically real or psychologically true. Nothing like that. It has to be really real, like scientifically real. And that seems to be, again, a mistake that they're making.
Well, and I feel like there's so many forces societally right now that are pushing us towards maintaining those confirmation biases. Did you see the documentary, The Best of Enemies, about Gore Vidal?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I love that.
I mean, it was so wonderful. So it's about Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley Jr. and the debates they had during the presidential election. What it was, 68?
Yeah, I think it was 68.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have that wrong. Just edit it and make me sound smarter. Just kidding. But what was so amazing is not only their rivalry and the Sturm und Drang, and I went in, for me, I probably approach things from a center left perspective. And I thought I'd go in with my sympathies lying with Gore Vidal. And there were so many things William F. Buckley Jr. said that really kind of turned my head around. And that was so interesting. And one of the things they were saying about that was sort of the last time that everybody would tune into the same channel about politics. And no matter what your beliefs were, you had to listen to a masterful practitioner of the English language convey the opposite of your view. Because whoever was watching, rooting for, Team Vidal or Team Buckley, you had to see the opposite. And in a weird way, the split from that into Fox News and MSNBC, right? The split from that into your cultivated, highly curated online persona where you unfriend anyone who offends you or isn't liberal enough because you're ex-liberal, but they're only 0.5 ex-liberal. Or on the conservative side, right? You scream at people on Twitter, you get dopamine hits by the more extreme position you hold. And, we weaponize negative stories about the opposing political party for personal strategic gain. And then, even newspapers and publications that share proclivities with a certain party, like even left-leaning major mainstream media outlets are going to publish more things about extreme stories because of clickbait and eyeballs and market share. There's so many forces that are pushing this polarization, that it's really getting off course. And I think it's a bit of a modern overlay to the problems that you're talking about, where technologically it seems like we're up against all of these forces that do not appeal to our better angels.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's a good transition to your other line of work now of helping Democrats construct a better narrative. So let's start with the Trump narrative and why it worked. What are the elements that he tapped into that seemed to propel people to pull the lever for Trump in 2016?
Well, I think there's a lot of things. I think that what you see in the narrative that Trump put forth and that Bernie put forth, there's two aspects to that. And the first one is this overused word of authenticity, which I think we need to explore what that means. So Trump gets caught in a ton of lies, right? Like if you do an analysis of how many things he says that are factually incorrect, it's fairly mind-boggling. But the thing is that people don't realize is that Trump is actually honest in his emotional state and in the reaction that he has. And so there's a certain authenticity there that conveys to people a lack of bullshittiness, despite the fact that the facts might be wrong, that they did not feel, I believe, with Hillary Clinton. And so one of the examples that I point to is, do you remember during the debate where she brought out the opposition research about Miss Housekeeping and Miss Piggy from the Miss Universe pageants? Mm-hmm. And, she sort of presented this to say, oh, well, there's a woman in the audience tonight. And you called her all these names, and Trump got really flustered. Like, who told you that? Like, who said that? Where did you find that? And I feel like a lot of people from the left were sort of sitting back and cackling gleefully that she'd really nailed him. But what was happening was beneath that sort of pageantry of the debate was something on one level deeper. Was we were seeing one candidate pretending as if she had just thought of something that was actually a carefully researched, careful piece of produced opposition research, and presenting that in a manner that was sort of beatific and presidential. And the other person was genuinely flustered and angry. And even though the reaction, the win for that equation in the prefrontal cortex is score 1 point Hillary and none for Trump. But the thing is he had such an embodied, natural, authentic reaction to what was happening that is something that's actually, for many people, is more eliciting of trust than whether all the facts are right. So that's number one. And interestingly, that's something that Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez kind of pointed to, the difference between, like, I'm going to botch this in a paraphrase, but like moral rights versus actual facts. And of course, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had politicians who valued and cleaved strongly to the fact that both have to be aligned? But the other thing is I think that that both parties have left behind working people in this country and taken them for granted. And I don't think anyone was willing to talk about it. When Obama first ran for office, he had the fewest donations. His grassroots fundraising was at an all-time low with where the numbers were. By his reelection, he broke the record for most donations over $100,000 until Hillary Clinton, who had more donations over $100,000 than Donald Trump. Now, it is not my opinion, nor am I suggesting that she is a more corrupt or would have been a worse president than Donald Trump. That's not my belief. But what I do think is that there has been an increasing tilt towards us not having a fair playing field. And by this, I always want to distinguish by having a fair playing field, I mean at the starting gate only, right? If people are worried about entitlements, fair enough. They're very expensive. It's a big problem. There's a lot of corporate welfare that happens also. There's a lot of loopholes that happen with corporations. So what I'm saying is if we could clean up some of these conditions and, in my estimation, also help people at the starting gate to be able to show up to run the race. And it's something that a lot of conservatives actually believe, too. It's not like Ben Shapiro wakes up delighted that there's people being left off the economic dominance hierarchy. That's not a conservative position. They just don't agree with solutions or rule changes otherwise.
Right.
So if we can get everybody in a position that they have some footing to run the race on their own and determine their own future, that for me is a pervasive value. And I don't think it's one that the Democrats were conveying because they were too busy equating this sort of equality of outcome. And the problem is what we want is for everyone to be able to have a pair of boots, which lets them, pull themselves up by their bootstraps, to paraphrase, Martin Luther King, but then to distinguish themselves through their hard work and their innovation and their accomplishment and be able to distinguish a different outcome for themselves. And there's nobody who I know, not myself, not my kids, not Elizabeth Warren, not, Donald Trump, not Paul Ryan, not Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who doesn't want people to differentiate themselves on the basis of their skill and hard work. That's an absolute necessity. And so I think that the Democrats got very focused on a message that was muddied, and it was won over by a cleaner message of just sort of equality of outcome, diversity just for diversity's sake, rather than vehement anti-discrimination measures, right? And looking at things in that way. And there's other narratives that were simplifying that sort of came in, but there's a lot of people in this country who've been left behind. And if you look at, with for instance, a lot of people where we have suicide, we have the opioid crisis, and you overlay that with counties that voted for Trump, I don't think they felt that either party was listening to them. And to try and make a sophisticated argument that our party was 20% more concerned or less corrupt than them, anything that becomes a relative conversation is very tricky. And so one of the things that I think is very important for Democrats to do is to acknowledge the ways that we have not been as responsive to the needs of working people in the past, and the efforts that we're going to make to do that, but not to come in and, drown them in a sort of fake utopian, bathe them in a utopian light that fixes all their problems, but to start to put people back at the center of their own narrative, to start to put people back at the center of their own story, to differentiate themselves or not. Like, if you want to be lazy and not work hard, you're not going to have the same outcome as if you want to take advantage of opportunities.
Did you feel that Bernie had high levels of authenticity, but he was just never going to be the candidate because it was Hillary's turn or whatever?
I do. I mean, a lot of people think that Bernie would have won. I don't share that view. I mean, I've looked into some of the opposition research on him. There was a lot of stuff that's problematic. I tend to be, and look, this is an area where I'm way out of my depth, so I'd like to say that front and center. But I tend to be, my proclivity is towards a free market, with certain. But I also don't believe that free market should be in ways that are undermining American workers through arrangements that are patently unfair. I mean, so it's very complicated in ways that I'm not qualified to speak on. But I think that his approach was a little bit too far. It was too far towards the left on this, but I do believe that he's deeply impassioned about what he's talking about and believes it. I don't have any question that he's sort of full of shit or just doing it to get attention, or that he's carefully researched all the numbers and is putting it forth. And so I think people can have a vehement disagreement with where he stands, but I don't think he was overly curated as a candidate. And I think both he and Trump were talking to people who've been left behind. And I think there's one thing we can look at fairly, I don't think it's controversial to look at the separating gap since 1976 between the working class and the separation out of the top people. And for some of them, good for them, right? But for some of them, if it's based on sort of rigged rules and loopholes and, the way that TARP bailed out Wall Street versus bailing out, other people, it's like some of that is not wonderful. It needs to be addressed. And a lot of people are just looking at it going, none of this is speaking to me. I don't care what it is. I don't care who I'm going to vote for. It's not going to be another Clinton or another Bush. I don't care if I have to burn down my own neighborhood.
Right.
It's going to be something else. And that's what happened.
How did Democrats get past the charge of socialism/communism the moment they want to implement any kind of social programs, even the most reasonable ones, to help people that really we have a moral obligation to help, or those that are, sort of fallen through the cracks temporarily, or the opioid crisis or whatever? I mean, most conservatives who are religious would say, yes, we need to do something about that. Private charity. Democrats say, yes, we need to do something about that. Some government programs. But the moment they propose that, they get accused of, being lovers of big government and socialists and so on, even though conservatives love big government too when it comes to military and prisons and border walls and things like that. They spend just as much money as Democrats. So how do you advise, or what do you advise Democrats to get past that charge?
Well, first of all, I think we need to very much differentiate what the goals are. And I think it has to be stated with immense clarity that the goals are not to get in front of people in a way that's patronizing and sanctimonious and try to drag them forward, because nobody wants that. It doesn't help anyone. The goals are to clear some of the obstacles for people to be able to put on their shoes at the starting gate to create their own future or to screw up their own future. That what the aim is to get people in this country, to give them a fair shot at success. And if there's an accountability, which is a language that conservatives rightly like, that I think that liberals need to start to take more ownership of, because that is part of a classically liberal ethos as well. I think that one of the things that we need to do is to make better arguments rather than an approach of the far left. I'm not talking Democrats, I'm talking about the left, that tends to make is, I have a different opinion than you on something, right? You're like, conservatives are higher conscientiousness with lower empathy. It doesn't mean they don't have empathy. They just don't rank it in the same order. And a traditional left approach is to say, I see the point that you're taking on this position. I will look into you and find you morally deficient. And if I can educate you into higher empathy, which incidentally isn't, you can't educate someone into flipping big 5 personality traits, right? It's like going up to Cory Booker and going, Cory, dude, just be an introvert. Like, it's actually a fixed trait. And, if only you were more educated, then you would see things my way. So I think that what Democrats have been doing a great job of, and by this I mean people like Sherry Bustos, like we have a wave of amazing young candidates who are moderate. And by moderate, I don't just mean in policy. I mean in their willingness to engage intelligently, to talk across the aisle, to talk more openly with people who think differently than them, and to be more unifying. The approach has to be one that speaks to conservative and independent mindsets, because those are very important mindsets. Like having high conscientiousness and lower empathy on a ranking, I mean, that codes for, among other things, better health, better finances, more stable marriages, and longer lifespan. So before we can go in and start to condescend to everybody that they need to have more empathy, it's like they're actually doing kind of okay with stable marriages and longer lifespan. But if we can join with them in saying absolutely accountability, absolutely we need some measurement of these effects, and we need to talk about what's actually effective social interventions. But like one of the approaches that that I think was very important to take on healthcare, for instance, instead of saying, I believe in universal healthcare, Medicaid for all, where immediately you've just split the room and everybody retreats to their own, neural pathways and all the armor systems are up, is to really have an engaged conversation about the values that both liberals and conservatives share, which is to say, look, we have a baseline of healthcare in this country already. Nobody, conservative or liberal, wants people dying on the streets of America because they can't get care. So we have emergency rooms. Like if they die, it's not only immoral, it's un-American. If somebody's uninsured in an emergency room, the average cost of a visit is $1,233. The average cost of a vaccination is $19. So if we're paying for this based on a core value, what's an intelligent way that we can minimize the overall cost to us as a society to keep the society robust and flourishing? What's the best way we can spend this money and also try and keep people well? So that keeps them in the job force, right? It keeps kids going to school. It cuts down on public health outbreaks. And the other thing that a baseline of healthcare does, and you see this in Canada and certainly Denmark, is it's the highest. They both have a higher percentage of entrepreneurism than in the United States, because people are willing to take risks if they know that striving and failing at something doesn't mean the dissolution of maybe you have a special needs kid, right? Maybe you have a spouse with Crohn's disease or an elderly parent. If you feel like there's some baseline of medical care, you can strive to kind of innovate and try things to create new jobs in ways. Now, obviously, there's a ton of details and the devil's in the details, and there's a lot to go about it, but I think that having an approach that is more accepting and recognizing that a balance between conservative and liberal values, if both parties are healthy, and I'm working to make the party that I am most aligned with, I shouldn't say my party, but I think I'm most aligned right now, Democratic Party, that I want that to be the healthiest and most robust party it can be. But I'm also very encouraging and have friends and politicians across the aisle for any way that can be made true for Republicans. Because if both of these parties are strong and healthy and have basically different visions and views of how to fix these problems in America, then great. We both have to raise our game all the more. And if we lose in an election, we're losing in the hands of somebody to somebody or to a party that also has a genuine ethical desire to better the lives of Americans. And I think that what we're seeing is there's a lot of voters who are feeling like we don't have good faith actors on both sides of the aisle right now. Yeah. And like it would be disappointing but delightful to lose to an opposition ticket of people where I thought, you know what, I trust their moral character. I have a difference on viewpoints, but let's figure out how to work with them. I think that's something we all would feel so much more comfortable about politically.
Yeah. Why do you think Republicans, the more centrist or moderate Republicans, won't stand up to Trump or primary him in 2020? It seems unlikely unless something catastrophic happens. Is it just the fear of their jobs, or just toe the party line? That's our team. I'm sticking with them no matter what.
I think it's some of that. Some are. I mean, there's certainly voices. If you look at the Rick Wilsons and the Bill Kristols and the Evan McMullins, there's voices on the other side who have broken with Trump. And by the way, as much as the left wants to say that's what, I should say that there's a degree of moral firmness in that is really admirable beyond just what we think is obvious from the other side of the table. I mean, like, the thing I always look at is to say, if as a Democrat we nominated somebody who was liberal but like borderline crazy, like some crazy super liberal actor without credentials, how hard would it be for me to go to the polls and vote for Ted Cruz, right? Because that's the choice that you're asking for those people who believe that Trump is that detrimental. Right. Now, a lot of people think that Trump isn't that bad, right? So there's also that position where people are like, hey, he hasn't invaded Iraq yet, right?
Right.
And like he hasn't done a lot of the things that are equivalently bad. I do think that some of it is also game theory. Like, every time Trump has been wounded and it seems that he's going down and somebody breaks from the pack to take him down, he's come back to life and then stomped them. I do think right. So I think people are really reluctant to break ranks. But the other thing is, look, Republicans are very good at unifying behind a cause. I mean, I think they're less inclined to the circular firing squad that Democrats are, right? I mean, so conservatism and liberals, I think, get off course in ways that are different, right? So conservatives tend towards sort of fascistic means, but the way that liberals get totalitarian when they kind of get more rigid is it becomes purging and with purity tests and cannibalistic. I mean, that's what you see with, Mao Zedong and Stalin in North Korea, where he's executing his uncle with, like firearms from a helicopter. Right. It's this constant sort of purging thing. And what's interesting is Republicans, and this can be immensely positive and it can also be negative. Both sides have positives and negatives, are much better about falling in behind a cause that they believe in. And so, like, their messaging discipline is always better, because I think Democrats will skew with higher openness, which is the trait we were discussing earlier. A lot of different opinions, a lot of different stuff. And that is one of the strengths of the Democrats, in that there's a lot of idea generation. But when it comes to rowing in the same direction and pulling behind somebody, I do believe that Republicans do that better. And so we're seeing some of that inherent tendency, conservative tendencies, falling in behind Trump as well.
Yeah, Dennis Miller had back in the Gore-Bush election, Dennis Miller had a funny riff about, Gore is a nuanced chess player considering all the moves on the board, and Bush is a checkers player. He just wants to, boom, 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 captured. Right. And Miller, who's at that time was shifting more toward being a conservative, said, the world sometimes is just really good and bad. It's simple. I just want a good checkers player. I don't want one of these nuanced things. And I think a lot of conservatives feel that way. And Trump is, super simple. We're just going to close the borders, do a couple of big things here, and it's all going to be great. A lot of people don't want that nuanced, sort of left, liberal, sophisticated, educated. We're going to think about it, and I'm going to listen to you, and I'm going to cogitate and ruminate about it. Then we're going to vote and decide, and so on. It's like, fuck that. I just want the guy that's going to come in and blow the doors off and fix it, and I don't have to think about it anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was an appeal. I mean, unfortunately, some of these questions like border security, require more nuanced and sophisticated discussion, yes, right? Like, how many drones can we buy? Can we put 3,000 more Border Patrol agents on the border for the same price as this initial down payment on the wall, right? 800 miles of the border are over river. Do we cede that to Mexico? Like, it's very complicated. Yeah. But in fairness, if it's complicated and it gets wonky, and if there's a whiff of condescension to it, then people will prefer to go towards something that's more simple and clear and is a clear statement of what those values are.
Now you make a distinction between liberalism and being on the left, right? Mm-hmm. The left is too far. Sometimes the regressive left or something like that. I do think Trump came along at a time when the left kind of lost its mind. That far left or regressive left or alt left or whatever we want to call them, all that excessive political correctness really harmed more centrist or moderate liberals.
Immensely. Or even liberals who might have policies. And this is one of the things that I've been realizing recently is when I talk about moderate or centrist candidates, there's sort of two camps. One of them is just in policies, but one of them is an ability to engage in Enlightenment discourse and have appreciation for opposing views. So I don't even mind if someone comes from a deep blue district and has more innovative, progressive policies, as long as they're willing to engage and discuss them and figure them out and put them into the blue sky think tank atmosphere that we talked about, and not be condescending and patronizing that everyone else isn't educated enough to have caught up to this. And so what's actually more important to me when I talk about moderate or centrist is actually this willingness to engage in the kind of discourse and the kind of strenuous intellectual exercise and moral goodwill with people who think differently than you that should characterize politics. It doesn't even just come down to positions. Of course, some positions of the regressive left are patently ridiculous. And I think there's certain ways that we've also betrayed our own core values. Like if I was a single issue voter, for me, it would be the First Amendment. I'm a writer. Right. I mean, that's always something. And I mean, I remember when I was in high school, a lot of the pressure of like, you can't listen to Ozzy Osbourne. Like it was the Christian right? I can't believe anyone's reading like, Ulysses has pornographic content or whatever it is. And it's like, wait a minute, liberals are supposed to be the ones that when people want to compress or suppress new dangerous ideas, when they're burning books, we're supposed to be there with buckets of water putting out the fire.
Right.
And as soon as the left becomes the people who are the ones who are wanting to burn the books because it's damaging, I mean, figuratively, right? Who want people to be deplatformed, who want ideas to not be discussed, who want to not read books like Huck Finn because it uses language that's difficult to hear when it's one of the most radically anti-racist documents ever created. When we're the ones who start to advocate for that, I think what happens is there's a level of hypocrisy for what the party should represent that is so pronounced that it opens up a lot of space for a different story to fill that. Yeah. So if we want to fill that with a better story for Democrats, good on us. But if we don't, someone else is going to fill that space. And, Donald Trump was a better storyteller in that last election. I think that's hard to argue. I don't like a lot of aspects of the story that he told, but he knew how to tell the story.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Hillary was just so scripted. It seemed like she was just, reading the script that had been edited and rewritten a dozen times, whereas Trump seemed spontaneous. He's not comfortable even reading a cryon and so forth. And he was funny and more entertaining. You hate to think that our system could be susceptible to that, but obviously it is. It is.
And the other thing I'll say about Hillary Clinton is, I went to a smaller event that she was at, and what was amazing was she was speaking, she was just sort of in conversation, and she was actually so funny and just blazingly charismatic. And so what's interesting, which I've been giving some thought to, is like, look, a lot of people don't like her for a lot of reasons. She's also been in the public eye. Like, there is no question the level of that woman's, first of all, intelligence and her toughness. Mm-hmm. Her toughness is almost unparalleled. Mm-hmm. I mean, like, it is unbelievable. And I'm talking about political toughness, just sheer political scrappiness. The number of hits that she took decade after decade after decade. And you can see how that would lead to somebody being armored or more scripted. And so it's this funny thing that I've been thinking about now as we're looking at 2020 and every dog catcher in America is entering the fray to be a candidate. Right. But in a weird way, if you look at the people who've ascended rapidly to the stage for, whether it's Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, part of how they managed to do that with a degree of freshness is that they've been outside of the public discourse to some extent. And there's not as much to parse over and to dig through and to go through. And there's not as long that they've been there to grow, to feel all the vulnerabilities that need to be protected and armored. And so it's sort of like there's this weird paradox that in some ways, and again, I'm not arguing that the people best qualified to run and to be the president are lifelong politicians. That is not my argument.
Right.
But there's clearly a lot of expertise that can be accrued, but in a weird way, in the accruing of that expertise, if it's through more conventional means, there's so much that one is exposed to that the degree that they will get scripted and armored goes up exponentially. And we don't want to just go to the newest, freshest face either. Right? We're seeing a lot of that impulse, and it's like, that's not the right answer either. So it's a very unbelievably complicated persona that we're waiting to emerge, who feels fresh and not a career politician, who hasn't been, hammered down and built all these defenses and overly scripted, but also knows a lot and also is really charismatic. Yeah, I mean, there's so many different poles, and it should be. I mean, it's the most powerful person on the planet.
Yeah, the first time I spoke at TED was in 2006 in Monterey, and Al Gore gave his Inconvenient Truth speech just before the film came out. But part of his stage presence, and a lot of us commented about this, he was warm and engaging and funny, almost doing stand-up on stage.
Yeah.
And so this is 2006. I was like, where was this guy in the 2000 election? Because he was so wooden and stiff with his charts and graphs and statistics, and here he's just on stage. That was the personality that we needed, because that's kind of how Bush came out. The famous bit about who would you like to have a beer with? I want to have a beer with Bush. Well, I would love to have a beer with Gore. He at TED, he was like a normal guy. It's almost like you need to convey to these politicians, be a little personable or be yourself. Don't seem so scripted. I don't know if you can train somebody that isn't naturally like that.
Yeah, well, I think we're seeing a bit more of it. I mean, I think that one of the things that's helpful is, look, I think the whole country was humbled in 2016, because I don't think anyone could come out of that sort of bruising presidential race and feel like we have all the answers, or that any of the old methods of engagement are going to work. I don't think that everything's gotten significantly better since then. But I will tell you that the rise of new voices within the party, within the Democratic Party in particular, there's an awful lot of people who speak in a way that is much more aligned with where I'm coming from. There are a lot of new voices. And if we can just stop the media from only discussing the polar opposite or edges, frankly, of both parties, there's a lot more common ground. But there's not a lot of money or airtime or clickbait or readership to gain talking about, reasonable, competent, across the aisle advances, right?
Yeah,
or somebody making a really smart, considered point about an economic policy. We don't flock to that. You go on Twitter, everyone wants to light their hair on fire, blasting stuff and get dopamine hits and clicks, and it's a very different instinct, but there's a lot going on now that for me is very promising. A lot of the people who stepped forth as candidates in 2016 or 2018, sorry, for these midterms, it's an amazing crop of young people and young talent. So.
Yeah, I was recently rereading George Lakoff's book on moral psychology, and he talks about, so he's a cognitive psychologist, and he specializes in the cognition of metaphors, and that most of the world we engage with, we don't really understand it. We have to use language to kind of carry the idea into our brains, transport it there so it'll stick. Like string theory, it's like a violin string or whatever. The consciousness is like a digital computer. No, it's like a parallel processor. No, it's like a quantum computer. Because we don't really understand what's going on with the brain. So when he talks about the nation, what is a nation? And the metaphor most of us use is it's like an extension of our family. Well, what kind of family is the nation? And so he divides liberals and conservatives based on their metaphor of the family, and that conservatives have a strict father family model, and that liberals have a nurturing parent family model. And so conservatives, the language they use is that, the world is a dangerous place. It's harsh, and it's sort of a Hobbesian, nasty, brutish, in short. It's the role of the strict father to impose discipline on the family, economically, behaviorally, to the kids and so on, and we got to punish them because if they go out into the world unprepared, they are going to lose. It's going to be a disaster, and so on. And the liberals are like, no, parents should be nurturing to their children, and therefore politicians should be nurturing to the people that need help. So, and he sort of deconstructs that based on speeches that politicians give. They use certain kind of words that are code for what kind of family you believe is the right kind of family. And so this idea that conservatives believe in small government, this is utter bullshit. No, they don't. They spend is just as much, if not more, money than Democrats do. But it's on military because we need a strong defense because there's evil nations, and police. We need a strong protection from bad actors in our own country. We need strong borders because the rapists are coming here and so on. And all of that is strict father family language that codes for whatever it is you have in your head that you think is the right kind of family. And I think there's something to that. I haven't seen him comment on Trump, but Trump seems to be in that model. Like, I am the strict father. I'm going to come in here and impose discipline. And that's what's going to make America great again. And Hillary was more like the nurturing mother that's going to come in and help everybody that needs help, using that kind of language. So I almost feel like that political speechwriters need someone like you to come in there and write the speeches for them. Like, what's the narrative arc we're going to construct in this 10-minute speech or 20-minute speech? What words should we pepper in there that are going to tap, not just the far portion of our political party, but the centrists that might leak over here. We want to capture them back here.
Well, and what to avoid, right? So you were talking about the regressive left as distinct from liberal or most of the Democratic Party. And, one of the things that I realize is the negative approach. So that you're talking about the things that are positives. And I agree with that. It's a very interesting distinction. But the thing is when the left takes a point of view of like, how dare you not care about this sick person's child because you won't vote for health care and you're a monster with no ethics. The shrinking of the Overton window that puts you outside of it, right? Like you're unacceptable morally for the positions that you hold. One of the things I think about in this family model is that it elicits a childlike shame in the people that it's being directed on. And that shame is people want to guard against that. It feels very old. And I think that it's different than like when Trump gets angry or goes after someone, to my mind, he's more like a blustering bully. Like you kind of know that drill. You don't feel as young as you feel outraged by it. People who are outraged by things that he says. But there's something that's unique with that approach of the left of like, you're not morally acceptable to me. That seats people in a childlike shame. And if you think about conservatives who are people who want a sort of defensive, tough, patriarchal father model of the universe, being told that your very views are something worthy of shame, people will cover that shame it can be rage inducing to be spoken to that way. And so a lot of what sometimes I perceive to be the outsized anger directed at idiot lefty stuff, I think comes from that. It's such a uniquely vexing position to take to people, and it plays on their psychology in a way that's really like the patronizing, sanctimonious nature of it can really cause a backlash of anger. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing. And there's a different chemistry to them in different ways, because certainly there's no small amount of the left and the liberals and the Democrats being fired up in the face of what Trump does. I just think that there's a different texture to it.
Yeah, some of my conservative friends, basically voted for Trump because it was a fuck you vote against the left, the far left, the people that they know are making fun of them as being, people in the flyover country, the deplorables, they're ignorant, they're stupid. And, you watch, most comedians are liberals and they make fun of the right and Trump supporters or whatever. So, but they're not that stupid. They know they're being made fun of. So Trump was like a fuck you vote. Even though, surprisingly to me, because I followed, politics now for about 40 years. My first election was, 72. So that would have been Nixon. The far, or at least the Christian conservatives, Well, I lost my train of thought there. I forgot what I was going to say. They sort of took the moral high ground and would have voted for someone like Ted Cruz, who's pretty religious, sort of a centrist Republican or maybe slightly to the right, but not as crazy as Trump. And so I was shocked that Cruz didn't get the nomination there, just traditionally. So Trump, again, even on that side, was very disruptive in that way.
Yeah. All right. So before we start to wind down,
Yeah.
I do want you to go back and answer the question, which is, you have this vehement set of intellectual ethics by which you conduct your life, and it's with it's a religious like devotion and dedication. And I was just wondering if you could talk about where you source that. Like, where did that come from?
Oh, okay. Well, this is kind of a bigger question of where do morals and ethics come from in the first place. And in my debates with people like Dinesh D'Souza and some other theists, when I push them pretty hard on it, because they're clearly not getting their morals and values and ethics from the Bible, or if they are, they're picking and choosing and cherry picking in just a handful here and there. It ends up being from that still small voice within, which is where I get it. Well, what does that mean? The still small voice within, this sort of Immanuel Kant's The Two Great Mysteries, the starry heavens above and the moral impulse within. Where does it come from? Well, I think I get it from the same place you do, where more Christians get it, conservatives get it, liberals get it, and so on, just from our culture, which has shifted ever more broadly to accept more people that are diverse and different from us, to expand the concept of civil rights and civil liberties and so on. I think I get it, like the same place everybody else gets it. Personally, I was raised in a non-religious home. My parents weren't anti-religious; they just didn't come up. But there were still clearly conveyed moral values where they got them, same places as the rest, culture. When I became a Christian, I was a Christian for 7 years. I would say, although I may articulate more clearly moral values as coming from the Bible, really I was no more moral then than I was now. If anything, I was more sanctimonious and censorious to those who weren't Christian. So becoming a non...
Yeah. I want to meet that Michael Shermer.
I wasn't nasty about it. Because by temperament, I'm pretty easygoing. So, but still, I kind of felt, at least inside, I know you're wrong and you're immoral for not believing the way I believe. And that's not a healthy attitude.
How old were you?
Well, so I became a Christian at 17, and so 7 years later, 24, I gave it up. And in part, it was because when I went to graduate school, so I went to undergraduate at Pepperdine, so I'm in a bubble of this is Church of Christ, so it's all conservatives and Christians. Gerald Ford came to speak. President Ford came to speak, and Edward Teller came and gave a speech about his mutual assured destruction, and everybody was reading Atlas Shrugged. It was that culture of the 70s, right? So, and I bought all of it. Yeah, this is absolutely right. Then I went to a state university, just secular university for graduate school, and there, it never came up. There was no bubble to be in. And at the same time, I was taking courses in social psychology and anthropology and sociology, and I did I went through my comparative mythology, Joseph Campbell stage, and all that. And I realized, what are the chances I'm the one that got it right with this one particular religion, and all these other people that obviously believe as strongly as I do, they're wrong. Now, for a moment, I thought, yes, I am the one that got it right. And then I thought, come on, Shermer, what are the chances of that? Maybe it's all socially constructed. It depends on where you're born and how you're raised and so on. And so that made me, I'm somewhat open-minded by temperament anyway, so that made me even more open-minded. And traveling, I started traveling a lot, and that makes you more open-minded. And back to your question, the hard question is, where do these come from if there's no outside source? And so my short answer is, it comes from the fact that we're a social primate species that evolved moral sentiments of right and wrong that you have to get along with other sentient beings in your tribe that are just as selfish as you are. And in the moral arc, I build starting with Dawkins' selfish gene model in his book, in which he makes the distinction between what's the difference between a rock and an organism is that a rock won't kick back if you hit it. That is, you have to. So back to Jordan Peterson too. You have to develop a kind of a sense of right and wrong and justice, and I'm going to fight back and push back if you try to take advantage of me. So social groups cannot tolerate bullies and cheaters and free riders. There has to be some mechanism to push back and fight back, and developing a reputation of being a badass that you're not going to put up with somebody taking advantage of you. You said you were bullied. I was too. Also in 7th grade, it seems to be that time of childhood where that happens. And I didn't push back. I didn't fight back. And I'm angry at myself for not doing that. And I kind of wish I would have had somebody to push me a little harder on that. Because that'll always stop a bully. If you fight back, they'll usually back off. In any case, so I think that that the whole kind of history of civilization has been to develop certain traits that come forward to deal with those kinds of problems. Now, you can't have a social system that's 100%, like we'll never have any bullies or free riders ever, because then you invest all of your resources to solving that one problem. So we can tolerate a certain amount of free riding, cheaters of the system, or a certain amount of bullies. So there'll always be like 1 to 3% psychopaths or sociopaths that are bullies and try to cheat the system. You can't get rid of all of them, but we can tolerate a little bit and we'll survive. So I think really that's what we've been doing for thousands of years is kind of fine tuning bringing out the better angels, pressing back down on the inner demons. And it's a balance. And I think
that's like the argument that, like the one of the predominant means of our contemporary justice system is to relieve family members from the responsibility of exercising revenge on the people who have harmed their loved ones. Mm-hmm. Right.
Self-help justice. Yes, I was just reading this big LA Times article yesterday about El Chapo. And, the trial is ongoing as we speak here in New York City, and the numbers that are coming out are just staggering. These are not just, drug thugs or even drug lords. These are like international business conglomerates. These are captains of industry. I mean, we're talking billions of dollars. And this guy would just bribe people for, tens of millions, or he gave the president of Mexico $100 million bribe. $100 million, okay. And the amount of money they spent assassinating people, spying on people, all the stuff they had to do that could have been spent, And the reason, there was a great quote at the end of the article saying, if you can't go, when you're working in this business, you can't go to court and sue the guy that violated your contract or you had a deal with, because it's all illegal. So you have to settle the justice yourself. So this is called self-help justice, and it's expensive. So when I tweeted this yesterday, I said, here's an argument for legalizing drugs. It just ends the whole black market, the whole, assassination, self-help justice system, bribery, all the, billions of dollars spent in bribery and assassination.
Plus, then we all get to do drugs all the time.
That's right. That's
bonus.
Right. Yeah. So, anyway, that's
great.
That's the bigger question. I think that's my book, The Moral Arc, Steve Pinker's Enlightenment Now and Better Angels of Our Nature. I think, those kinds of questions are really scientific questions. They're political, yes, but political science. That is, these are all experiments we can run. At Prohibition, we ran that experiment, didn't work. Now that ever since the war on drugs in the 70s, it's a failed experiment. Why are we not learning from this? It's a data point. It failed. Okay, let's try something different. That kind of thing.
Great.
So, Greg, we've been going for an hour and a half. This is great. It's all gold.
Wow.
Yeah. All
right. Well, I'm gonna see you shortly. I appreciate you having me on here. This is a lot of fun. And I'm sure we're going to have more to talk about. So next time, let's do it lubricated ever so slightly with some brown liquid.
That's right. We'll do it like the way, Dave Rubin has whiskey in his studio. Joe Rogan has whiskey and marijuana in his studio. So, yeah. But I'll be posting this the week that your book comes out. Out of the dark. You'll be on probably a book tour that week. So that'll be good. And we'll revisit this in 2020 after the election then, and you could give us the breakdown on who had the proper narrative.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, my friend.
All right. Thanks, Greg. Very good.
Bye.
Bye-bye.